One morning in the year 536, somewhere in the Roman world, a farmer walked outside to check his fields. The sun was up, but it gave no warmth and it cast no shadow. He didn't know it yet, but it would stay that way for the next year and a half. And by the time the light came back, his entire world would be starving. This is the year historians now call the worst year in human history. Not 1349, when the Black Death erased half of Europe. Not 1918, the year 536. And the strangest part isn't what happened. It's that almost nobody remembers it did. We only proved how bad it really was a few years ago, and the way we proved it is genuinely strange. We'll get there. Let's start with the sky, because that's where it began. In the early months of 536, a fog rolled across the northern hemisphere. Not a normal fog. This one didn't burn off by midday. It didn't lift after a week. It hung in the air over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia for 18 straight months, and it did something to the sun that people had no words for. We don't have to guess what it looked like, because the people living through it wrote it down. A Byzantine historian named Procopius was traveling with the Roman armies that year. He recorded that the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for the entire year. He wrote that it looked like a sun in permanent eclipse, and he added one line that should stop you cold. From the moment it began, he said, people were never free from war, or plague, or death. Far to the west, in Italy, a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus was watching the same sky. He described a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, a summer without heat. He wrote that at noon, the human body cast no shadow on the ground. The moon, even when full, looked empty of light. He said the seasons themselves seemed jumbled together, as if time had come loose. Read those accounts today, and they sound like the opening of an apocalypse. For centuries, that's exactly how historians treated them, as exaggeration, as superstition, as the kind of thing frightened medieval people wrote when they didn't understand an eclipse. But here's what's strange, they weren't exaggerating. If anything, they were understating it. Because while the sky dimmed, the temperature collapsed. Summers across the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. That doesn't sound like much. It was catastrophic. It triggered the coldest decade the planet had seen in over 2,000 years. Snow fell in summer in China. Crops froze in the ground from Ireland to the Mediterranean. The Irish chronicles of the time record it plainly, a failure of bread from the year 536 onward. Think about what that actually means. Not one bad harvest. Harvest after harvest, failing across 3 continents at the same time, with no warning and no explanation. There were no satellites, no scientists, no one to tell a starving village that the problem was a sky full of ash. They only knew the sun had turned its face away and the food had stopped growing. And starvation on that scale doesn't just empty stomachs, it empties everything. Granaries run dry, then markets, then trust. People who had spent their whole lives in one village walked away from it, looking for food that wasn't there either. Whole communities thinned out, scattered, and in some places simply stopped existing. The records from this stretch get thin precisely because the people who would have kept them were too busy trying to survive. Silence in the historical record is often its own kind of evidence. And then, into a world already weakened by years of hunger, came the second blow. In 541, a disease appeared in a Roman port in Egypt. It spread along the grain routes, the same routes that fed the empire, and it moved fast. We call it the Plague of Justinian now. It tore through the Eastern Roman Empire and killed somewhere between 1/3 and half of its entire population. An empire that had spent centuries building itself was gutted in a generation. Historians point to those years as the moment the ancient world stopped recovering and started ending. So we have a famine that crossed continents, a plague that emptied cities, and a sky that went dark for a year and a half. A genuine candidate for the worst stretch of time a human being could be born into. Which brings us to the real mystery. If 536 was this catastrophic, why have most people never heard of it? For most of modern history, the honest answer is that we couldn't prove it. The written accounts survived, but they were scattered, fragmentary, and easy to dismiss. A line here about a dim sun, a note there about a failed harvest. Without a way to connect them, they looked like isolated complaints from a superstitious age. The event was too big to see, because the people who lived through it could only describe their own small corner of it. And then, 14 centuries later, the proof turned up frozen in ice. There's a glacier high in the Swiss Alps that has been quietly recording the air for over 2,000 years. Every year, snow falls and compresses into a new layer, and trapped inside each layer is a sample of whatever was in the atmosphere that year. Volcanic ash, dust storms, pollution, drill out a long core of that ice, and you're holding a timeline you can read like tree rings. In 2018, a team led by a Harvard historian named Michael McCormick and a glaciologist named Paul Majewski did exactly that. Using a laser, they shaved that ice into slivers thin enough to capture a few weeks of snowfall at a time. And when they reached the layer for early 536, they found it. A spike of volcanic ash laid down right at the start of the darkness. The fog had a source. Sometime in early 536, a massive volcano erupted, almost certainly in Iceland, and threw a veil of ash and sulfur so high into the atmosphere that it spread across the entire northern hemisphere and blocked out the sun. And it wasn't alone. The ice showed two more major eruptions close behind it in 540 and 547. 3 blows, one after another, to a world that never got the chance to stand back up. The cold that followed lasted in places for more than 100 years. For the first time, the scattered horror stories of Procopius and Cassiodorus snapped into focus. They hadn't been writing myth, they'd been writing the weather. They were eyewitnesses to a planetary disaster, and they told the truth, and it took us 1400 years to finally believe them, so that's how we proved it happened. But it still doesn't explain why we forgot, and the answer to that is quieter and a little sadder than the disaster itself. We forget 536 because the people it hit hardest were the ones least able to write it down. Catastrophes are remembered by survivors who have the time, the safety, and the literacy to record them. The year 536 stole all three. It killed the farmers before the historians. It scattered communities before they could build a shared story of what they'd lived through. The suffering was almost total, and total suffering leaves very little behind. A famine doesn't build a monument. A plague doesn't carve its name into stone. There's also something stranger working against our memory. We remember history as a story of people. Kings, wars, decisions, names. We are not built to remember a villain that has no face. And the worst year in human history had no army, no emperor, no single moment to point at. Its cause was a cloud of dust from a volcano nobody saw erupt, in a place nobody was watching, doing its damage in total silence. It's hard to fear something you can't picture, so we simply let it slip out of the story, and maybe that's the part worth sitting with. We tend to imagine that the things capable of unmaking us would announce themselves, that the end of a world would be loud, but the closest the ancient world ever came to ending didn't arrive as a war or an invasion. It arrived as a faint grey haze in the morning sky, the kind of thing you might glance at and forget by lunch. The people of 536 didn't get a warning. They got a dim sun and a cold summer and a slow understanding that something was wrong with the world itself. They lived through the worst year a human being has ever faced. They wrote down exactly what they saw, and then, for 14 centuries, we filed their testimony under superstition and looked away. The fog lifted eventually. The harvest came back. The survivors rebuilt and their descendants forgot, and the year that nearly ended, the ancient world faded into a footnote that most people will never read. We found the ash. We read the ice. We finally know the truth. But for 1400 years, the worst thing that ever happened to us was just sitting there in the historical record, waiting for someone to look up at the right layer of frozen sky and finally understand what those frightened, honest people had been trying to tell us all along. The sun went out for a year and a half, and we almost never knew.